As authors, we're often tempted to defend our work from what we see as unwarranted attack. Our books hold a little piece of our souls. They take time, effort, and if they're done right, they're something we treasure. It's an inevitable fact that you're going to get negative reviews. I've stated before that there's little to nothing you can do about negative reviews. This is only half true. There's a lot you can do about them, but none of it will help you, and most of it will hurt you. Shad Brooks recently put out a video about his book called What People Really Think of My Book. I honestly couldn't believe he did this. So I listened to it. It didn't improve things. In many ways, I'm grateful to Shad. His tantrums on Twitter have made my review of his book my most watched video to date. His refusal to bend to any pressure or bend to any logic has made sure the views and comments stay high. But what does Shad have to say about his own work? Well, in the video he references Daniel Green's now taken down initial review of Shadow of the Conqueror, saying it was great. He does go on to mention that Green does eventually publicly state his love for the book. Then Shad goes on to read a number of high reviews and a single mid-review. This, I believe, is what he wants you to think people think of his book. He does go on to somewhat address the negative reviews, but he basically says it's people review bombing him because of his stance on AI art. As someone who read and reviewed the book before Shad became the king of the AI bros, I had to comment on the video. But we'll get to Mr. Brooks's response to me later. Shad mentioned in the video that he sold over 40,000 copies, and the book currently sits at 4.6 stars out of 5 on Amazon. He touts this as a triumph of the book, and most people would do the same, but most people don't have a YouTube channel with over 1.5 million subscribers. I have no proof beyond my own experience that it was mostly fans who bought his book and gave it positive reviews to support him. But even if they did, I have little to no problem with that. You should support creators you like. But Shad doesn't take this into consideration. Recently I reviewed Nightbane by Alex Astor. Miss Astor and Mr. Brooks are in pretty much the same boat. They both have dedicated fan bases willing to support them, and both have written some of the worst books I've read this year. Granted, Astor's work is far worse than Shad's, but that doesn't make it any better. Shad is defending his book as if it was one of his AI art pieces, and it's not going to do him or his work any favors. If you're familiar with the BookTube, AuthorTube community, you'll know the usual scandals. Popular author pays for fraudulent reviews, popular author attacks reviewers, and popular YouTuber writes mediocre book and attacks former friends and fans because they don't like it. People get into books because the money barrier is low. They mistakenly think it will be easy because they're passingly literate. Each of the scandals I presented above have one common factor. They all have the video defense. So why is it a dumb idea to make this video? First of all, it makes the author look incredibly insecure. Shad's video was skewed with positive reviews, dismissing the negative ones entirely, appealing to the high rating. The last 2 books I read were also highly rated, and both were pop culture garbage. If Shad had done nothing and allowed the ratings and reviews, which I believe are padded by his followers, to simply speak for the book, he would be far better off. As it stands, he looks like he knows the book is bad, and he's just sensitive about it. Something you'd be familiar with if you've seen him defend AI art. Second, this is feeding the trolls. On the internet, the moment you let people know something bothers you and you start insulting them, they will turn around and attack you in your giant glowing weak spot that you've just presented. Yes, negative reviews can hurt. Having the flaws in your book exposed will hurt. But most bad reviews are people's honest opinions. At least they are if you're not attacking people. Or it's not something political. You're making something for public consumption, and these people took the time to express what they found wrong and their personal thoughts. It's not an attack, it's a chance to improve as a writer whether you accept the criticism or not. Getting honest feedback from people you're close to or people who follow you can be incredibly hard. A bad review may be the closest thing you'll get to real criticism of your work. Even paying a professional is tainted by the fact that you're paying them. Third, This is needless controversy. Making this video will not get Shad more good faith readers. It's going to send people scurrying off to find reviews of his books. I can promise Shad's not going to like what they find. After reading and reviewing the book myself, I looked to what other reviewers thought. There were a handful that liked it, but the vast majority pointed out things like the weird sex stuff, Dalen being a Mary Sue, and the endless, pointless exposition. A little humility would take Shad a long way. He's a new author, and your first book is usually your worst. I'm a fairly fresh author myself, on my way to publishing my third book. Where me and Shad differ is he believes he's perfect from the get-go. This is nothing new for him. I've watched as artists who originally liked Shad and tried to be friendly and constructive turn into his greatest opponents, laughing at him and attacking him everywhere they can. And not without merit. So let's get into something I found unbelievably funny. I commented on Shad's video. At the time of recording, I have about 250 subscribers, and Shad has just over 1.6 million. I know, we're so close it's not even funny. I took my time to consider what I would say, and here's what I sent. Having read the book, made an hour-long review of the book, and had a 3-hour live stream discussing the book, here's my summation. It's a bad book. There's way too much exposition, Dalen is a Mary Sue that all the other characters bend to. Worst of all, there's a far too long section near the end where Dalen spends 10 minutes explaining the physics of how a skyship works, and he actually gets into the math. I like your videos on swords and castles, your writing needs work. 20 minutes later, Shad hits me with a word break. Presented as posted at the time of recording, along with all spelling and grammatical errors. I hope you can understand that the things you describe here are subjective opinion and does not define the book being objectively bad. It's just not to your taste. Heaps of fans of my book have shared with me that the world-building exposition parts are some of their favorite parts, and I wrote them that way because I enjoy this writing style. Several readers point out the scene you mentioned where Dalen even explains briefly a little bit of the math behind skyships as a part they particularly liked, which happens before halfway through the book, nowhere near the end as you claim, which makes me doubt how well you're able to give an accurate review. It's a hard fantasy, and many people love this style of writing, as do I. If you don't, that's fine. But to not acknowledge that this is a subjective critique shows your limited perspective as a reviewer, just as with your opinion of Dalen is a Mary Sue. I'd suggest you look up the definition of what that means. Dalen gets defeated and fails multiple times. He is hated by most people and has some of the biggest character flaws. He literally cannot qualify for the definition of a Mary Sue. He is a prodigy and incredibly skilled, form a lifetime's work, but that just feeds into his other character flaws. Got that after a few takes? So let's break this down. Yes, this is my opinion. That's what reviews are. Shad cited several in his video that show his book in a positive light. You can't dismiss something as opinion when what your whole video is about is people's opinions. Moving on to his next section, because I didn't read out the first section again. Heaps of fans of my book have shared with me that the world-building exposition parts are some of their favorite parts, and I wrote them that way because I enjoy this writing style. Many people like reading how things work. They also like watching shows about it. There's a particularly addictive series called How It's Made that's a good example of this. But this is supposed to be a novel. It is common practice to keep your exposition to a minimum. The modern writing convention is to show through the actions of your characters the world and how it works. It's one of the things that makes writing a challenge. A novel is not 300 pages of world building, and I apologize if you feel attacked by that. The reason exposition should be kept short is because it takes you out of the story. Sitting in a classroom to learn the methods of engineering is an informative thing, but it's painfully dull to read about. Moving on to his next section. Several readers point out the scene you mentioned where Dalen even explains briefly a little bit of the math behind skyships as a part they particularly liked, which happens before halfway through the book. Nowhere near the end as you claim, which makes me doubt how well you're able to give an accurate review. It's a hard fantasy, and many people love this style of writing, as do I. If you don't, that's fine, but to not acknowledge that this is a subjective critique shows your limited perspective as a reviewer. I'm still quite certain that the scene in question happens in the second half of the book. I went with the audiobook because the constant power testing Dalen does was distracting and boring. It is possible to forgive a little math in a novel, but I experienced it at the end of a 10-minute exposition Sunday. I do my best to stay as accurate as I can in my reviews. I take extensive notes to reference from my scripts, because I want to be fair and do justice to the book. The problem in this case is this book could be charitably called an exposition dump. Every other chapter is Dalen testing his powers, pointless explanations of things that never show up again, and named characters who only show up once and do nothing to continue the story. If someone is reading the dictionary to me, I would get bored too, and pointing out where I was most bored is an exercise in pedantry. Attacking me as a reviewer is another thing. I'm telling you what I experienced with what you wrote. Your book was all I had to go on. Once done, a book must stand on its own. You won't be over every reader's shoulder to explain what they should see or what they should think. Regardless of what you meant, this is what I took from what I read, and I read a lot. If your readers, myself included, aren't taking what you want from your story, that isn't the fault of the reader. It's the fault of the writer. It's why writing is harder than most people think. Moving on to the last section. Just as with your opinion of Dalen is a Mary Sue, I'd suggest you look up the definition of what that means. Dalen gets defeated and fails multiple times. He is hated by most people and has some of the biggest character flaws. He literally cannot qualify for the definition of a Mary Sue. He is a prodigy and incredibly skilled, form a lifetime's work, but that just feeds into his other character flaws. Dalen is a Mary Sue, or a Gary Stu as some people call them. Dalen is handed his powers. He's the master of everything he tries, and no character challenges him or stands in his way. Everyone is quick to forgive him despite him being one of the worst dictators in the world's history who did some truly awful things. I can't think of one point in this book where he actually fails, aside from attempting suicide. He is the strongest without question and wins every fight he's in. Everyone just does what he wants until the end of the story where he's put on trial. And despite having the body count of a mid-century dictator in both death and questionably aged girls, they basically let him go. He ends the book more powerful than ever. He's part of an organization that's very powerful, but doesn't have anybody in it who can check him. Throughout the book, he's basically making up powers which he masters with little to no practice or sacrifice. Dalen kills several people in the book in ways that would be considered outright murder. Like when he breaks through someone's wall like the Kool-Aid Man and literally emasculates them. I know the guy inside was doing something reprehensible, but how can Dalen justify rampaging around the city, breaking into randos' houses, and executing them? The idea of a law that supports this is laughable. Every government wants a monopoly on the use of force. They would not allow a law that lets randos rampage around a city, killing people they think did something bad. The idea of vigilantism is explored in several books and shows. I know in the book Shad comes up with some legal argument as to why Dalen is in the right with what he did. But normal people wouldn't stand for this either. Dalen has no way to prove that the man inside was doing something terrible. Even the girl he saved is probably more terrified of him than her father, because he broke through a second-story wall and emasculated her father in front of her. Extreme violence aside, Dalen flies through the book facing no repercussions for his actions until the very end, and even then he's just let off. The book would have been better, marginally so, if he'd died at the final battle, as that was his goal throughout the whole book. The trial at the end only drags the story out and makes Dalen feel like more of a Mary Sue because he's killed millions of people, raped hundreds of women, and is basically allowed to walk free. Oh, he's part of an order who will watch him, but isn't this the same order that just lost most of its members? The same order that was hunting Dalen through most of the book and were never able to bring him in? I'm not going to turn this into a What's Wrong with Shadow of the Conqueror's world. I might start a series later exploring what's wrong with different worlds. And if you want to know more about what's wrong with this book, you can look at my review. I just wanted to point out that you don't attack people who review your work. It takes a lot of time to read, note, record, and edit, and I would like my reviews to stay bias-free. When you attack people who review your work, all you're doing is making sure many attack you in the future, and that there will always be an audience happy to listen. Good luck, everyone.